In the winter of 2018, inside a climate-controlled laboratory at the Birbal Sahni Institute of Paleosciences in Lucknow, India, researchers carefully extracted genetic material from a fragment of ancient human bone. The bone was more than 4,500 years old. It had been recovered from a burial site at a village called Rakhigarhi, located in the Hisar district of what is today the Indian state of Haryana. The village appears unremarkable from the surface, surrounded by wheat fields and modest rural development. But beneath those fields, buried under layers of silt and centuries of silence, lies something that archaeologists have spent decades struggling to fully understand. Rakhigarhi is not simply an ancient ruin. By current measurements, it is the largest known urban settlement of the Indus Valley Civilization, a city that may have housed as many as 80,000 people at its height, spreading across more than 350 hectares of land. That makes it substantially larger than either Harappa or Mohenjo-daro, the two sites whose names have dominated textbooks for more than a century. The genetic extraction from that burial was enormously difficult. Ancient DNA from South Asian skeletons is notoriously resistant to recovery. The subcontinent's tropical and subtropical climate degrades biological material at an accelerated rate, and many previous attempts at extracting usable genetic material from comparable sites had produced nothing at all. But this particular individual, a woman buried more than 4,500 years ago in what archaeologists designate as Burial Site H at Rakhigarhi, had survived in a condition that made genetic analysis marginally possible. The bone was cleaned under sterile conditions, and genetic material was extracted from the dense inner layer of the petrous bone of the skull, a region known to preserve ancient DNA better than almost any other part of the human skeleton. When the results were finally sequenced and analyzed, they were published in September of 2019 in the journal Cell. The lead investigator was archaeologist Vasant Shinde of Deccan College in Pune, one of India's most respected authorities on Harappan archaeology. The genetic analysis was conducted in collaboration with the Ancient DNA Laboratory of David Reich at Harvard University, one of the most respected ancient genomics institutions in the world. What the DNA revealed was immediately significant, not because it confirmed existing expectations, but because it challenged one of the most fiercely contested questions in the entire history of South Asia. Where did the people of the Indus Valley Civilization actually come from? Who were they, genetically? What connection do they have to the more than 1.4 billion people living in South Asia today? And does their ancestry reframe what we thought we understood about the origins of Indian civilization itself? These are not merely academic questions. The answers carry profound political dimensions, deep cultural implications, and the potential to fundamentally reframe how one of the largest populations on Earth understands its own deep origins. The investigation that follows examines what the genetic evidence actually shows, what the archaeology has long suggested, and what the combination of both fields now reveals about a civilization that was, by almost any measure, one of the most sophisticated the ancient world ever produced. If this kind of investigation into the forgotten chapters of human history interests you, consider subscribing. What emerges from this evidence is unlike almost anything mainstream accounts of this civilization have fully explored. The story begins not with science, but with ruins. In 1872, the archaeologist Sir Alexander Cunningham, then heading the newly established Archaeological Survey of India, visited a mound in the central Punjab region at a place called Harappa. Cunningham had been led there partly by reports from a British engineer named Charles Masson, who had noted the mound decades earlier while working on railway construction and recorded that local people were using fired ancient bricks as ballast for the railway tracks, bricks of a size and quality that clearly predated any recent construction. Cunningham documented some unusual artifacts, including a seal bearing an inscription in an unfamiliar script, but he did not grasp the full significance of what lay beneath the mound. He noted the site and moved on. It was not until 1921 that an archaeologist named Daya Ram Sahni returned to Harappa with systematic excavation equipment and the full backing of the Archaeological Survey of India. Sahni's work confirmed that something of extraordinary antiquity lay beneath the mounds. But it was the following year that changed the history of archaeology permanently. In 1922, another archaeologist named R.D. Banerjee was working approximately 400 miles to the southwest, at a site called Mohenjo-daro near the Indus River in the Sindh region. Banerjee uncovered fragments of worked stone, fired brick structures, and small carved seals bearing inscriptions in a script nobody could read or recognize. When both excavation reports reached John Marshall, the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, he understood immediately that these two sites were not independent local curiosities. They were part of something vastly larger. In 1924, Marshall announced to the world that a previously unknown ancient civilization had been discovered in the Indus Valley, a civilization that appeared to be contemporaneous with the great Bronze Age cultures of Mesopotamia. The announcement caused an immediate and sustained sensation among scholars worldwide. Nothing in the established record of ancient history had prepared anyone for what the ruins revealed. The cities at both Harappa and Mohenjo-daro had been built with a level of urban planning that was, in some respects, more sophisticated than anything in contemporary Mesopotamia or Egypt. The streets were laid out on a grid system, oriented with careful attention to the cardinal directions. Buildings were constructed from precisely standardized baked mud bricks. An elaborate drainage and sewage network ran beneath the streets, connecting individual houses to covered brick-lined drains that carried waste and wastewater outside the city perimeter. Individual homes had bathing platforms connected to this drainage network. That level of sanitary engineering was not seen again in Europe until the Roman Empire, thousands of years later. There were public water storage facilities, large structures that may have served as granaries, and communal bathing installations. The most famous of these, the Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro, measures approximately 12 meters in length and 7 meters in width, with a depth of nearly 2.5 meters. Its floor and walls were lined with bitumen, a natural waterproofing material, to prevent leakage into the surrounding soil. Whatever its function, whether ritual purification or civic hygiene or something more complex, its construction required both technical mastery of materials and a high degree of social organization sufficient to mobilize the labor required to build it. The scale of what had been uncovered was unlike anything previously imagined for this time and place. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, the civilization archaeologists now call Harappan had extended across an area of approximately 1,200,000 square kilometers. That is larger than the combined territory of contemporary Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. It stretched from what is now eastern Afghanistan in the west to the dried riverbed of the ancient Saraswati River in the east, and from the Himalayan foothills in the north to the Gujarat coast and the shores of the Arabian Sea in the south. More than 1,500 sites have now been identified, ranging from major urban centers that covered hundreds of hectares to small agricultural villages and seasonal coastal trading posts. The sheer geographic extent of this cultural uniformity across such a vast landscape is one of the most remarkable features of the entire civilization. Subsequent decades of excavation continued to expand the picture significantly. A site called Dholavira, located on the island of Kadir in the Rann of Kutch, in what is now the Indian state of Gujarat, was discovered by archaeologist J.P. Joshi in 1968 and excavated extensively over many seasons by R.S. Bisht of the Archaeological Survey of India. Dholavira is unique among Harappan sites in several important respects. Unlike Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, where construction was almost entirely in baked brick, Dholavira used both stone and brick together, producing a citadel of distinctive visual character unlike any other Harappan urban center. The site features an elaborate system of water management that may be the most sophisticated of any Harappan city. A network of reservoirs, channels, and regulated dams designed to capture and store monsoon rainwater in an environment where seasonal rainfall was the primary water source. The largest reservoir at Dholavira measures approximately 73 meters in length and 29 meters in width. The sheer investment of labor and planning required to construct and maintain this water infrastructure suggests that the management of water was not merely a practical concern, but one of the defining organizing principles of Harappan civic and possibly ritual life. The coastal dimensions of the Harappan world tell a similarly ambitious story. A site called Lothal, located in the Gulf of Kambat region of Gujarat, was excavated in the 1950s and 1960s by archaeologist S.R. Rao. At Lothal, researchers found what appears to be a tidal docking basin, a large rectangular structure measuring approximately 214 meters by 36 meters, connected to a river channel by a sluice gate that could regulate water flow with tidal cycles. The surrounding warehouse facilities and the variety of trade goods recovered leave little doubt that Lothal was a major maritime commercial hub. Among the artifacts found there were carnelian beads of a type also documented at Mesopotamian sites of the same period, evidence of sustained trade networks connecting the Indus coast to the Persian Gulf more than 4,000 years ago. Those trade connections with Mesopotamia are now thoroughly documented through both archaeological and textual evidence. Indus-style cylinder seals and distinctive square stamp seals have been recovered from excavations at the ancient Mesopotamian cities of Nippur, and Lagash. Cuneiform administrative texts from roughly 2300 BC refer to a trading region called Meluha, identified by most scholars as the Indus region, and describe merchants arriving with timber, carnelian beads, ivory, shell, and fine cotton textiles. Some cuneiform records mention Meluha ships docking at Mesopotamian harbours, which suggests the Harappan maritime trade involved direct voyages by Indus mariners into the Persian Gulf, rather than merely passive exchange through intermediaries. Genetic and archaeological evidence also shows that the Harappans were importing raw materials from far beyond their own borders, including lapis lazuli, sourced from the mines of Badakhshan in what is now northeastern Afghanistan, tin, possibly from sources in Central Asia, and various shell species from specific coastal regions. Sustaining these networks across generations required institutional stability, reliable commercial conventions, and the accumulated trust that only long-term commercial relationships can build. Yet, the more archaeologists examined the Harappan world, the more it defied easy categorizations alongside the other great civilizations of its age. Almost every major Bronze Age civilization of comparable complexity, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in China, in the Aegean, left behind clear and abundant evidence of organized warfare, weapons caches, dedicated military architecture, mass burials indicating large-scale violence, royal tombs filled with sacrificial retainers, commemorative reliefs depicting military campaigns and the subjugation of enemies. The Harappan civilization left almost none of these things. The weapons found at Indus sites are modest in number and variety, and do not resemble dedicated military arsenals. No structures have been positively identified as palaces or military barracks. No tombs of kings have been found. No monuments to military conquest. No depictions of warfare anywhere in the art or seal iconography. Some scholars have argued that this absence reflects a society that expressed power through commercial control and ritual authority rather than through military force. Others have proposed that a federation of merchant interests organized the civilization's affairs rather than any single ruler or ruling class. Whatever the explanation, the absence of war commemoration is among the most distinctive and puzzling features of the Harappan world and sets it apart from every other Bronze Age civilization we know. That question of how power was organized brings us directly to the script, because if we could read it, we might finally know. Across hundreds of Harappan sites, archaeologists have recovered thousands of small square seals, pottery fragments, and flat copper tablets bearing a system of written signs. The Indus script consists of approximately 400 to 500 unique symbols, typically used in sequences of between 3 and 7 signs per inscription. The signs appear to function at least partly as logograms, where each represents a concept or word, possibly combined with phonetic elements that remain unidentified. The longest known single inscription is a row of 10 signs found at Dholavira, apparently mounted at a prominent entrance to the citadel, suggesting that inscribed messages were displayed in public locations and held civic meaning for those who encountered them. Whether those signs announced a ruling authority, a civic proclamation, a dedication, or a declaration of territorial identity, we cannot say. The Indus script has been the subject of serious decipherment attempts for more than a century, and without successful resolution. The most sustained scholarly effort has been that of Finnish linguist Asko Parpola, who began working on the script in the 1960s and has produced decades of careful research, arguing for a connection between the Indus signs and the Dravidian language family. Parpola's approach uses the rebus principle, by which a sign depicting a specific object can be read as representing the sound of that object's name in the underlying language, to propose phonetic readings of specific Harappan signs based on reconstructed Proto-Dravidian vocabulary. His work has attracted genuine scholarly engagement and serious critical responses in equal measure. Several other research teams have proposed entirely different linguistic affiliations, some arguing for a connection to early Indo-Aryan, others proposing that the script may not represent a spoken language at all, but rather a purely logographic administrative system. Without a bilingual text, definitive decipherment remains scientifically impossible with current methods. This linguistic uncertainty is directly and importantly relevant to the genetic findings, because the language the Harappans spoke is part of the same deep puzzle about who they were. Before the DNA evidence, the dominant models for Harappan origins fell into two broad camps. The first argued that the civilization was largely indigenous, developing out of earlier farming communities in the region through gradual agricultural and social complexity over several thousand years. The second emphasized migration and cultural influence from Iran and the broader Fertile Crescent, pointing to similarities in early pottery styles, domesticated animal species, and site layouts between the earliest Harappan settlements and contemporaneous cultures in southeastern Iran and Balochistan. The genetic evidence was widely anticipated as a potential resolution of this long-standing debate. In some ways it delivered one. In other ways, it made the picture considerably richer and more nuanced than either camp had anticipated. The critical framework came from the field of ancient population genomics, which uses the extracted DNA of ancient human remains to trace population histories over thousands of years. Ancient DNA analysis has undergone a revolution over the past decade and a half. Advances in laboratory contamination control, in sequencing technology, and in computational methods for distinguishing genuine ancient genetic signals from modern contamination have made it possible to extract reliable genomic information from remains that would have yielded nothing 20 years ago. Samples must be processed in clean rooms specifically designed to exclude modern DNA. The petrous bone of the skull, which has a particularly dense mineral structure, has emerged as the most reliable source of ancient genetic material in warm climate burials. Even with optimal sampling, the DNA recovered is highly fragmented, and sophisticated statistical methods are required to reconstruct usable genetic information from thousands of short, damaged fragments. By 2018, this methodology had transformed our understanding of prehistoric population movements in Europe and Central Asia, establishing that major migrations had reshaped the genetics of these regions during the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods. A landmark paper in the journal Nature in 2018, coordinated by David Reich's laboratory at Harvard and co-authored by a large international team of researchers, brought the same methods to bear on South Asia. The paper combined genetic data from ancient individuals across Iran, Central Asia, and South Asia with statistical models derived from living populations across the region, producing the most comprehensive picture of South Asian population history yet attempted. It proposed that modern South Asians descend from at least three major ancestral sources. The first was a population of hunter-gatherers who had inhabited South Asia for tens of thousands of years, referred to in the technical literature as Ancient Ancestral South Indians, or ASI. This population was most closely related to the Andaman Islander populations, who have remained genomically isolated from mainland populations for tens of thousands of years, and it represents the deepest human layer in South Asian history, stretching back to the earliest arrivals of modern humans on the subcontinent after the Great Dispersal from Africa more than 50,000 years ago. By the time of the Harappan period, this ancient population had already mixed in varying proportions with later arrivals. The second source was a population genetically related to the early farmers of the Zagros Mountains, in what is today western Iran, who expanded into South Asia, beginning in the Neolithic period, bringing agricultural practices and herding traditions with them, and mixing with the existing Arsi population over thousands of years. The third source was a population of pastoralists from the Eurasian steppe, associated with the Yamnaya cultural tradition and its Bronze Age successors, who expanded dramatically across Eurasia during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, and whose genetics are strongly associated with the spread of Indo-European languages across a vast area from Western Europe to the Indian subcontinent. In 2018, no confirmed ancient DNA from an Indus Valley Civilization site had been successfully sequenced, so the paper had to infer what the Harappan population looked like based on modeling from surrounding populations and later South Asian genomes. The model it proposed was elegant and testable. The Harappan people were likely a mixture of ancient ancestral South Indian hunter-gatherers and the Iranian-related farming population, and they had contributed significantly to the ancestry of all later South Asians, with the steppe-related ancestry arriving only after the Harappan urban phase had passed. That inference was directly tested by the Rakhigarhi study published the following year. When Vasant Shinde and his team published the ancient genome from Rakhigarhi in 2019, the key finding can be stated plainly. The ancient woman from Rakhigarhi showed genetic ancestry consistent with a mixture of two sources, the ancient Iranian-related farmer population and the Arsi hunter-gatherer population of South Asia. She showed no detectable ancestry from the Eurasian steppe, none at all. The genetic signature that characterizes Indo-European-speaking populations arriving from the steppe, a signature now well documented in ancient individuals from the Yamnaya horizon of the Russian steppes and in the ancient populations of Europe who were reshaped by the Bronze Age migrations, was entirely absent from her genome. This result was significant for a specific and long-contested reason. One of the most fiercely debated questions in South Asian scholarship is the question of the Indo-Aryan migration. The Vedas, the oldest sacred texts of the Indo-Aryan tradition, describe a culture centered on horses, chariots, cattle herding, a rich pantheon of sky deities, and elaborate fire rituals. The language of the Rig Veda, the oldest of the four Vedic texts, is closely related to Old Iranian, Greek, Latin, and ultimately to all Indo-European languages. The standard linguistic and archaeological interpretation, supported by converging evidence from historical linguistics, archaeology, and now ancient genomics, is that speakers of early Indo-Aryan languages arrived in South Asia from the Eurasian steppe, moving through Central Asia and the mountain passes of the northwest, sometime in the broad period between 2000 and 1500 BC. This is precisely the same time window during which the Indus Valley urban centers were in decline. For more than a century, the relationship between the Harappan civilization and the incoming Indo-Aryan speakers had been one of the most contested problems in South Asian scholarship, and, it must be said, one of the most politically charged. Some scholars argued that the Aryans were the civilization builders themselves, that the Vedic and Harappan worlds were one and the same people, continuous in both culture and biology, with the Rig Veda representing the literary product of the very civilization that had built Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. This argument was attractive to some nationalists who wished to establish the Vedic tradition as indigenously South Asian and not the product of any external migration. Others argued that the Harappan civilization was a completely separate tradition and that the Indo-Aryans arrived only after its collapse, encountering a landscape already emptied of its greatest urban achievements. The genetic evidence from Rakhigarhi made the most extreme version of the continuity argument scientifically untenable. The Harappan woman had no steppe ancestry. The genetic signal associated with Indo-European speakers was absent from the Indus Valley during the civilization's mature urban phase. That ancestry entered South Asia later. But this immediately raised a different question. If the Harappan people were a mixture of ancient Iranian farmers and South Asian hunter-gatherers, how far back does that fusion actually go? The answer draws us to one of the most important sites in the entire story of human prehistory in this region. The earliest known agricultural settlements in what is now Pakistan date to around 7000 BC at a site called Mehrgarh, located in the Balochistan region near the Bolan Pass, where the western mountain ranges descend toward the Indus Plain. Mehrgarh was excavated by a Franco-Italian archaeological team led by Jean-François Jarige beginning in 1974, and subsequent excavation seasons have continued the work across several decades. The site shows an unbroken sequence of occupation lasting several thousand years, from early Neolithic levels through the Chalcolithic and into the formative Harappan period, making it one of the most critical sites in the world for understanding how complex civilization developed in South Asia. The people at Mehrgarh cultivated barley, wheat, and dates, herded goats and sheep and cattle, and produced some of the earliest fired pottery in the region. They also demonstrated something remarkable that goes well beyond basic subsistence. Excavations revealed drilled human teeth, suggesting that craftsmen at Mehrgarh were experimenting with treatment of dental decay approximately 9,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest known sites in the world for evidence of dental surgery. Genetic analysis of ancient skeletons from Mehrgarh, published in connection with the broader South Asian genomics program, found that the early farmers there showed a high proportion of ancestry related to the Neolithic and Chalcolithic farmers of Iran, but not identical to the Iranian population itself. They also showed significant proportions of the ancient ancestral South Indian ancestry that was absent from the Iranian farmers, and that reflects the deep indigenous human heritage of the South Asian subcontinent. This means that Iranian-related ancestry reached South Asia through a process of migration and mixed over centuries and millennia with the hunter-gatherer population that had been living in the region for tens of thousands of years. The product of that ancient biological encounter, deepening and stabilizing over millennia at sites like Mehrgarh, eventually gave rise to the population that built the Indus Valley Civilization. What this means is that the Harappan people were not transplanted Iranians who imported civilization from the West. They were not simply indigenous South Asians who developed independently of outside contact. They were the product of a deep biological and cultural fusion between two ancient populations, a process that had been unfolding for thousands of years before the first great cities appeared at Harappa or Mohenjo-daro. The civilization was, in a real sense, born from the encounter between two ancient worlds. What that fusion population then built is worth examining in some detail, because specific features of Harappan material culture continue to raise questions that conventional frameworks have not fully resolved. The standardization of Harappan material culture across its enormous geographic range remains one of the most discussed puzzles in the field. Archaeologists have recovered standardized weights from sites stretching from Pakistan to Gujarat, from Balochistan to Uttar Pradesh, spanning the full extent of the civilization's known range. These weights follow a consistent binary progression based on a unit of approximately 0.86 grams, with ratios of 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and 64 appearing consistently across the entire system. This degree of commercial standardization across more than 1,500 sites, spread over more than 1 million square kilometers, implies either a central authority capable of enforcing commercial standards over vast distances, or a system of shared professional culture so deeply embedded that uniformity was maintained by consensus and guild practice rather than by any coercive administrative enforcement from above. The bricks tell precisely the same story. Harappan baked bricks, regardless of where they were manufactured or found, follow a consistent dimensional ratio of 1 to 2 to 4 across their height, width, and length. At a major city in what is now Pakistan, and at a small settlement in what is now India hundreds of kilometers away, brickmakers working generations apart were producing bricks to the identical proportional specifications. Whether this reflects a centralized administrative state, an interregional network of craft guilds, or a deeply shared technical tradition passed down through artisanal communities, it implies a degree of cultural and professional cohesion across enormous distances that is genuinely remarkable for the 3rd millennium BC. The absence of obvious royal or military iconography becomes even more striking when set against the material records of contemporary civilizations. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, the presence of political authority is physically inscribed everywhere, in commemorative stelae that name specific rulers and their military victories, in temple reliefs that depict campaigns against enemies, in royal burial goods of extraordinary elaboration. In the Harappan world, almost none of this exists. The most elaborate human depiction from the entire civilization is a small carved stone head found at Mohenjo-daro, excavated by Ernest Mackay in the 1920s. It shows a male figure with a patterned garment, a headband, and eyes that may have been inlaid with a different material. Early excavators named this figure a priest-king, a title that has persisted in popular accounts ever since. There is no actual evidence that this figure held any kind of political or religious authority. It is simply the most elaborate human sculpture recovered from Mohenjo-daro, and what it represents remains genuinely unknown. The seals provide some of the most intriguing and frustrating evidence in the entire Harappan record. Thousands of small, square stamp seals have been recovered from sites across the civilization's range, made primarily from steatite and carved with remarkable precision using stone tools and abrasives. The most common animals depicted are the zebu bull, the elephant, the rhinoceros, the crocodile, and a creature that has no anatomical parallel in nature, a single-horned bull-like animal that researchers call the unicorn motif of the Indus seals. This creature appears more frequently than any real animal across the entire seal record of the civilization. Whatever it represented in Harappan symbolic culture, perhaps a mythological being, a clan identity, a divine emblem, or a commercial marker, it was clearly central to Harappan iconographic life. One seal has attracted more scholarly attention than any other. Found at Mohenjo-daro and now housed in the National Museum of India in New Delhi, it depicts a seated figure in what appears to be a cross-legged meditative posture, surrounded by four animals: an elephant, a rhinoceros, a buffalo, and a tiger. The figure wears what appears to be a horned headdress. John Marshall, who published an influential analysis of this seal in the 1930s, interpreted the central figure as a proto-Shiva deity in a yogic posture, lord of the animals, linking the Harappan tradition directly to later Hindu religious practices. That interpretation has been enormously influential in popular accounts, but has also been extensively criticized by scholars who argue it projects later Hindu categories backward onto a culture whose beliefs we fundamentally cannot access through the available evidence. The debate around this single carved object captures the central difficulty of Harappan studies. The physical evidence is rich, precise, and durable, but the meaning it was intended to convey is sealed away from us. What makes this debate relevant to the genetic evidence is the following logic. If the Harappan people contributed significantly to the ancestry of those who later developed Hindu and Vedic traditions, then the religious symbolism of those seals may represent a genuinely ancestral layer of South Asian spiritual culture that was transmitted both biologically and culturally to later populations. If, however, the Vedic tradition was primarily introduced by incoming steppe ancestry populations with a substantially different cultural background, then the connections between Harappan symbols and later Hindu imagery may be the result of cultural synthesis and adaptation rather than direct ancestral transmission. The genetics cannot settle this question definitively, but they provide the biological framework within which the cultural question must be considered. Modern South Asians carry ancestry from all three of the major population sources identified by genetic research: the ancient South Asian hunter-gatherers, the Iranian-related farmers, and the Eurasian steppe pastoralists. But the proportions vary enormously across the subcontinent. People in southern India, particularly those speaking Dravidian languages such as Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam, tend to carry substantially less steppe ancestry than people in northern India, particularly those in upper caste communities speaking Indo-Aryan languages. The steppe ancestry proportion in some North Indian Brahmin communities reaches 30 to 40% or more. In some South Indian communities, it exists in low single-digit percentages, sometimes barely above the limits of detection. This geographic and social distribution tells a compelling story. It suggests that the Indo-Aryan migration, carrying steppe-related ancestry, primarily and most intensively shaped the genetic composition of the northern and northwestern parts of the subcontinent. The southern regions retained a population profile much more continuous, with what we now know was the Harappan genetic signature, a mixture of ancient South Asian hunter-gatherer ancestry and Iranian-related farmer ancestry, without the steppe component. The implications are extraordinary. The Dravidian-speaking populations of southern India may preserve, in their living genomes, something far closer to the original genetic identity of the Indus Valley Civilization than any other group of people alive today. The people of Tamil Nadu, in a genuine biological sense, carry more of the Harappan inheritance than many of the populations now living nearest to Mohenjo-daro or Harappa themselves. This provides at least circumstantial genetic support for Asko Papola's long-standing argument that the Indus script may represent a Proto-Dravidian language. The genetic and linguistic evidence, assessed independently through entirely different methods, converge on the same broad conclusion. The Dravidian-speaking South and the Indus Valley Civilization share a deep common ancestry that has persisted in the biological record for 4.5 millennia. The research of geneticist Priya Moorjani, who completed her doctoral work at Harvard and later joined the faculty of the University of California at Berkeley, addressed the timing of the major admixture event between steppe ancestry populations and non-steppe South Asian populations. Moorjani and colleagues published findings indicating that the mixing between what earlier studies called ancestral North Indians and ancestral South Indians occurred across a broad window of approximately 2,000 to 4,000 years ago, with the most intensive admixture concentrated toward the earlier part of that range. This timing is consistent with a model in which Indo-Aryan speakers entered South Asia during and after the decline of the Harappan urban phase, and gradually mixed with the existing populations over several centuries, rather than displacing them rapidly or completely. But the collapse of the Harappan urban centers is itself a profound and still incompletely understood event, and understanding it requires looking carefully at both the archaeological and the environmental record. Between approximately 1900 and 1700 BC, the great cities of the Indus Valley ceased to function as they had for 6 centuries or more. Mohenjo-daro, continuously occupied and rebuilt through at least 9 major construction phases, was abandoned. Harappa contracted dramatically in size and population. The elaborate drainage systems fell into disuse and were not maintained. Standardized brick construction stopped. The seals and their inscriptions disappeared from the archaeological record entirely. The standardized weight system vanished. The long-distance maritime trade with Mesopotamia, which had flourished for centuries, ceased. What happened? The traditional explanation, famously advanced by Mortimer Wheeler, one of the most influential archaeologists of the mid-20th century, was violent conquest. Wheeler pointed to a group of skeletons found in the late occupation layers of Mohenjo-daro, some appearing to show signs of violent trauma, and proposed that these were the victims of an Aryan invasion, the same event referenced metaphorically in the Rig Veda, where the storm deity Indra is described as a destroyer of enemy fortifications and a champion of the Aryan people against their foes. Wheeler's theory gave the decline of the Harappan cities a dramatic historical cause and fitted neatly with existing assumptions about the role of Indo-Aryan arrivals in South Asian history. It was also, for a time, widely taught and accepted. The theory has not survived subsequent scrutiny. The skeletons Wheeler cited were not found in defensive formations, not all within the same stratigraphic layer, and not numerous enough to represent a systematic massacre of a city population. Later physical anthropological analyses found that the bodies likely represent an accumulation of normal late-period burials from a city already in demographic decline, rather than the aftermath of a coordinated military assault. The genetic evidence from Rakhigarhi adds the final complication. If steppe ancestry populations did not arrive in significant numbers until after the urban decline was already well underway, as the genetics strongly suggest, then they simply cannot have been the direct cause of the collapse itself. Wheeler's invasion theory, whatever its other merits, does not match the biological record. What the current evidence points toward is a more complex and ultimately more illuminating picture of civilizational stress and transformation. Beginning around 2200 BC, a prolonged shift in the South Asian monsoon appears to have significantly reduced and destabilized rainfall across much of the Indus Valley region. This climatic disruption, known to Earth scientists as the 4.2 kiloyear event, referring to approximately 4,200 years ago, is documented across multiple proxy records from widely separated locations. Geological evidence for this event in South Asia includes sediment cores from the floor of the Arabian Sea that record changes in river discharge and wind-blown dust deposition over millennia, isotopic analysis of stalagmite deposits from caves in Rajasthan that preserve high-resolution records of monsoon rainfall variation, and pollen records from lake sediments across northern India that document vegetation changes consistent with a more arid and seasonally unpredictable climate regime. The same event appears in the records of multiple other world regions during the same period, and it has been associated with the disruption or collapse of complex societies from Egypt to Mesopotamia to China. Adding to this climatic pressure was the progressive desiccation of a major river system that had been central to the geography of Harappan settlement. The ancient Saraswati, a great watercourse that had supported an extraordinarily dense concentration of Harappan settlements along its banks, and which many scholars identify with the sacred river praised throughout the Rig Veda, was losing flow due to a combination of tectonic uplift and the hydrological capture of its tributary rivers by neighboring drainage systems. By the time of the major Harappan decline, what had been a perennial river capable of supporting intensive irrigated agriculture across a vast floodplain had been reduced to a seasonal stream. Satellite imagery and airborne remote sensing analysis of what is now called the Ghaggar-Hakra Channel in Rajasthan and Punjab reveal a paleo-channel far wider than the present seasonal watercourse, consistent with having once carried a major perennial river. The extraordinary clustering of hundreds of Harappan sites along this now dry channel confirms that it was one of the primary geographic organizing features of the civilization, and its loss would have removed the agricultural foundation from a very substantial portion of the inhabited Harappan landscape. The combination of monsoon weakening and the progressive drying of the Saraswati river system would have placed the agricultural surplus on which Harappan urbanism depended under severe and sustained pressure. There is archaeological evidence, however, that many Harappan communities did not simply vanish with the decline of the great cities. They adapted and moved, a clear pattern of smaller, later Harappan settlements in what is now eastern India, in the upper Gangetic Plain, and in parts of Gujarat and Rajasthan that received somewhat more reliable rainfall, suggests organized population dispersal rather than sudden annihilation. The material culture of these late sites carries unmistakably Harappan elements: familiar pottery forms, similar craft techniques, recognizable stylistic conventions in specific artifact categories. The great urban centers were not rebuilt, but the people who had inhabited them, and the accumulated knowledge they carried, dispersed across a wider region and continued to shape the communities that came after them. This process is better described as devolution than as catastrophic collapse. The population survived. Skills and traditions were carried forward in smaller-scale forms across a wider landscape. The Harappan contribution to the genetic composition of the later populations of the Gangetic Plain and peninsular India may represent precisely this story: the continuation of the Harappan biological legacy through dispersal and integration into new, smaller-scale communities during the second millennium BC, as the great urban centers were abandoned one by one. As steppe ancestry populations moved into South Asia during this same general period, they encountered a landscape that had been shaped for generations by the Harappan legacy. The communities they found were not simple pastoralists or subsistence farmers. They were, in many cases, the direct descendants of people who had built one of the most sophisticated urban civilizations in Bronze Age history, who had managed complex water systems across hundreds of kilometers, sustained long-distance maritime trade across the Arabian Sea, and maintained standardized commercial systems across an area larger than Western Europe. The interaction between incoming groups and the existing population was not rapid or uniform. Research suggests it unfolded across centuries, producing the genetic mixing that population geneticists have now documented in the patterns of modern South Asian genomes. What emerged from that interaction was not the replacement of one population by another. It was a new biological synthesis, layered onto an older foundation. The Vedic tradition, with its Sanskrit language, its elaborate fire rituals, its cattle-centered pastoral values, its pantheon of sky deities, developed in the context of that encounter between incoming and existing populations. Some researchers have argued that specific elements of Harappan practice survived the transition and were eventually incorporated into the emerging synthesis. Water purification as a religious concept, seated meditative postures, the deep ritual reverence for specific animals, the structural importance of the sacred bathing pool. Others are more cautious about such continuity arguments, noting that demonstrating cultural transmission across an archaeological and linguistic break is extremely difficult, particularly when the script of the earlier tradition remains entirely unread. But the biological fact is clear. The people who built the great cities did not simply vanish. They became, in the genetic sense, one of the primary ancestral populations of modern South Asia. The cross-cultural dimensions of the Harappan world offer important perspective when set against contemporary civilizations. The Harappan engagement with Mesopotamia, documented through both physical artifacts and cuneiform textual records, places this civilization firmly in the first rank of Bronze Age commercial cultures. To maintain commercial relationships across the Arabian Sea over generations required institutional stability, reliable production of exportable surplus goods, knowledge of open water navigation, and the accumulated commercial trust that sustains exchange networks across political and linguistic boundaries. The scale of that achievement is fully comparable to the commercial reach of Mesopotamia or Egypt. What sets the Harappans apart from those trading partners is not commercial sophistication, but the distinctive absence of the iconography of violence and individual power. In Sumer and Akkad, rulers built monumental temples in their own names, commissioned commemorative reliefs of military victories, and inscribed their genealogies in clay for eternity. The Harappans did none of this, or at least none that has been found across a century of excavation at dozens of major sites. That difference may reflect a fundamentally different political philosophy, one in which authority was organized around the management of water, the maintenance of commercial standards, and the governance of craft production, rather than around the celebration of individual power. It may also reflect a different understanding of what civilization was for. The mathematical and metrological sophistication visible in the Harappan weight system speaks to a culture in which precise quantitative measurement was institutionally valued and professionally maintained. The binary progression of the weight system, the consistent dimensional ratios of the bricks, and the evidence for careful orientation of buildings to astronomical cardinal directions all suggest a numerically sophisticated administrative culture. Whether this tradition contributed, through the biological and cultural continuity of the populations that inherited the Harappan legacy, to the mathematical achievements of later South Asian civilization, is an open question. The development of the decimal place value system, the concept of zero as a number in its own right, and sophisticated algebraic methods in India during the first millennium AD represents one of the most consequential intellectual contributions in human history. The lineage of those ideas passes through many intermediate traditions and cannot be directly traced to the Harappan period in any specific way. But the Harappan world, with its standardized binary weights and its precise brick proportions, stands as one of the oldest documented examples of institutionalized quantitative thinking on the subcontinent. The metallurgical capabilities of the Harappan world add yet another dimension to our understanding of their achievement. The Harappans worked copper and bronze extensively, producing tools, vessels, ornaments, and works of sculpture that represent a mature craft tradition. A cast bronze figurine recovered from Mohenjo-daro in 1926 by Ernest Mackay has become one of the most widely recognized and reproduced artifacts from the ancient world. It depicts a young woman in a relaxed standing posture, approximately 10.5 centimeters in height, with a naturalism and poise in the pose, and a technical proficiency in the lost wax casting method that represents a genuine achievement even by later standards. The figurine was not a unique curiosity. It was the product of a workshop tradition of accomplished metalwork that was maintained across the civilization's range and over multiple generations. Now, returning to the heart of the genetic evidence, the full significance of the Rakhigarhi findings deserves careful emphasis. The study found not only that the ancient woman from Rakhigarhi lacked steppe ancestry, but also that she showed no ancestry from the Andaman Islander populations, who represent the most isolated surviving branch of the ancient South Asian hunter-gatherer lineage, and no ancestry from East Asian populations. This places her firmly within the specific genetic continuum that belongs to the South Asian subcontinent. She was not an outlier. She was not an anomaly from some peripheral region of the civilization. She was representative of precisely the ancestral genetic profile that population modelers had predicted for a core Harappan individual, a deeply South Asian woman whose ancestry was shaped by the ancient fusion of Iranian farmer ancestry and local South Asian hunter-gatherer heritage, without the steppe genetic layer that would arrive in South Asia only later. What this means for everything we know about the builders of those great cities is now clear. The people who designed the urban grid of Mohenjo-daro, who engineered the covered sewage drains, who standardized the weights across 1 million square kilometers, who cast the bronze figurines and carved the unicorn seals, who traded with Mesopotamia and built the docking basin at Lothal, were neither Proto-Indo-Europeans nor genetically similar to the populations associated with the later Vedic tradition. They were something older, something distinct, something that had been forming on the South Asian subcontinent for thousands of years before any Indo-Aryan speaker arrived. They were the founders of the first great civilization on the subcontinent, and their biological legacy did not end when their cities fell silent. The questions that remain are substantial. We do not know what language or languages the Harappan people spoke. We do not know how they governed themselves, or by what mechanisms they maintained commercial and technical standards across enormous distances for centuries. We do not know what the symbols on their seals mean. We do not fully understand the precise cascade of pressures that brought their urban civilization to an end, and we do not know which specific elements of their religious or intellectual culture, if any, were transmitted to the civilizations that followed. But we know, now, with a degree of scientific confidence unavailable before 2019, who the Harappan people were in a biological sense. We know where their ancestry came from. We know that they were distinct from the incoming populations associated with Indo-Aryan languages. We know that their genetic descendants live in South Asia today, concentrated particularly in the southern regions where steppe ancestry is lowest. And we know that the story of how South Asia came to be what it is, with its remarkable internal genetic diversity, its multiple ancestry streams, its layers of language and culture and belief, cannot be told honestly without placing the Harappan civilization at its deepest biological and historical foundation. New excavations at Rakhigarhi are ongoing. Additional ancient genomes from South Asian sites are being processed in laboratories across multiple countries. Researchers are working to extract ancient DNA from Harappan period sites in Pakistan, where the climate makes preservation even more challenging than in India. Every new genome added to the dataset refines the existing models, tests their predictions against new evidence, and opens new lines of scientific and historical investigation. The decipherment of the Indus script, if it is ever achieved, will transform the entire conversation, providing the civilization's own account of itself in its own words and concepts for the first time. Until that happens, we are working with physical artifacts, ancient bones, and computational genomics to reconstruct the lives and identities of people who left us no readable text. For now, the words of the Harappan people remain locked away behind 4,500 years of silence. But the DNA speaks, and what it says is that the people of the Indus Valley, the builders of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa and Rakhigarhi and Dholavira and Lothal, were not a historical footnote or a preliminary stage in a more important story that came later. They were a fully realized human achievement, the product of a deep biological and cultural fusion between the oldest inhabitants of the South Asian subcontinent and the farming traditions of the ancient Iranian plateau, who built cities with running drains and standardized bricks and maritime docking basins before most of the world had conceived of such things. They organized commerce across a territory the size of Western Europe without, as far as we can currently determine, building monuments to any individual ruler. They traded with Mesopotamia across open ocean. They carved the images of real and impossible animals onto small stone seals and invested those images with meanings we have not yet recovered. They developed water management systems of extraordinary sophistication in some of the most challenging and rainfall variable environments in Asia. And when the monsoon shifted and the rivers dried and the cities emptied, they did not vanish into oblivion. They dispersed into the landscape that had made them, carrying their ancestry and their skills and their cultural memory forward through the generations. That ancestry flows through hundreds of millions of people alive today. It flows through the farmers of Tamil Nadu and the merchants of Gujarat and the fishermen of the Malabar coast, and through the communities of every South Asian city and village that carries, in its DNA, the unmistakable biological signature of that original fusion between the ancient inhabitants of the subcontinent and the farmers who moved east from the Iranian plateau thousands of years before the first Harappan brick was ever laid. We began this investigation with a single fragment of bone recovered from a field in Haryana and a question about who the people buried there actually were. The answer, delivered through the precise language of ancient genomics, turns out to be one of the most important discoveries in the modern study of human history. The Indus Valley people were a civilization unto themselves, genetically and culturally distinct from the later Vedic tradition, biologically continuous with the oldest human populations of the subcontinent, and ancestrally connected to hundreds of millions of living people across South Asia and its diaspora around the world. Their cities are ruins. Their script is unread. Their names for themselves are unknown. But their biology persists, encoded in the cells of their living descendants, speaking quietly and continuously about an achievement that lasted for centuries and left its mark not only in the soil of Pakistan and India, but in the genetic inheritance of much of humanity. The ruins are silent, the script has not been read, but the genome endures, and what it tells us, in the most literal biological terms that modern science has yet made available, is that the Indus Valley Civilization did not end. It became us. It became the substrate on which all of subsequent South Asian civilization was built, and it lives on, in the quiet biological language of inheritance, waiting for more of its secrets to be understood, patient across the millennia, present in every generation of those who carry its ancient legacy forward into the future without, until very recently, having any means of knowing they were doing so. That is what the DNA revealed. Not merely the ancestry of one woman buried in a wheat field in Haryana, but the deepest layer of the human story of South Asia, a story older than Sanskrit, older than the Vedas, older than every text and temple and political boundary through which this part of the world has been understood and contested and claimed. A story that, for 4,500 years, was written not in stone or clay or fired brick, but in the quiet, precise, patient language of biology, waiting for the science to exist that could finally begin to read it.